too close for me. Good. You can only focus on her because she's a great singer.
Good afternoon. I won't try to do that. And greetings. My name is Bruce Maloney. I am the chair of the Committee on Music and the Arts here at St. John's Episcopal Church in Bangor. On behalf of our transition priest, Rebecca Liberty, our wardens, our vestry, and all of our people, I am pleased to welcome everyone to this afternoon of celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. First, a couple of program changes. One of our readers, Dylan Murray, is under the weather. Dylan, if you are watching us, you are actually irreplaceable, but we have you covered. Our organist and pianist, Joshua Singer, has also suffered some kind of illness. Josh will record Jitterbug Waltz as soon as you get back, and we will post it to the website. In the meantime, Patty Stoll has very generously and I would say nimbly offered to take over accompanying duties this afternoon, and where we programmed Jitterbug Waltz, you'll find that in your programs, at the place where Jitterbug Waltz was to be performed, she is going to perform on Bended Knee, which is a section of From the Southland, the only work for solo piano by the celebrated African-American composer Harry T. Burleigh. Burleigh is historically important for having advanced the development of American art song and also for having adapted many African-American spirituals in arrangements that are widely performed today. From the Southland is dedicated to the composer Samuel Coleridge Taylor, about whom we will hear more later. A word about why we are presenting this program. Historically, the Episcopal Church is derived from the Church of England, and it remains in close relationship with Anglican churches around the world. This means that when all of us entered from French Street, we did not just enter a church in Bangor. We entered the church of Shakespeare, of John Donne, of George Herbert, the church of Jane Austen and T.S. Eliot, of W.H. Auden and Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis, and the church of Henry Purcell, Benjamin Britten, and Ralph Vaughan Williams. For almost 500 years, we have joined the arts of all kinds to our liturgical experience of the holy. In the last decade, in particular, we have dedicated efforts to advancing racial reconciliation, not just adopting slogans and not just seeking comfort, but forming relationships between Black and white Episcopalians, challenging ourselves to be vulnerable and to learn and to grow. This also is not new. There have been prominent Black Anglicans for centuries. This is the Church of Desmond Tutu. It is the church of the Reverend Pauli Murray, poet, priest, lawyer, and, as a lawyer, the brilliant architect of the strategy Thurgood Marshall employed in litigating Brown versus Board of Education. And we are indeed the church of Thurgood Marshall himself. The Harlem Renaissance. It was not an event. It wasn't planned, it wasn't organized, it wasn't branded, and at first it had no name. The Harlem Renaissance is a name given in retrospect to a great flowering of Black creativity that began about 1922 and continued through the Great Depression. Conditions were right. The Great Migration, a movement of Southern Black Americans from their homes in the former Confederacy to the cities of the North, had changed the demographics of the country both North and South. The Great War, World War I, had come to an end at great cost. Among the casualties was confidence in social stability. The remade map of Europe showed the relatively safe and reliable world of 1914 had not survived the war, had not survived the death, the sadistic cruelty, the trench warfare, mustard gas, and murder of civilians. The Roaring Twenties emerged from that shattering realization. In the United States, in the longer term, post-Civil War Reconstruction had been betrayed and frustrated, hence the Great Migration. But Black education had succeeded. W.E.B. Du Bois of Fisk, Harvard, and the University of Berlin, Zora Neale Hurston of Barnard College and Columbia University, Langston Hughes of Lincoln University, Jesse Redmond Fawcett of Cornell, and Rudolph Fisher of Brown University and the Howard University School of Medicine. All were ready to follow Paul Laurence Dunbar and an earlier generation of poets and writers in committing their own experiences in their own voices to poems, stories, and novels. When the energy and talent of these and other artists met post-war New York City, the ferment was historically productive. Not all of that energy was literary or artistic. The artists of the Harlem Renaissance were acutely aware of injustices in society, the injustices that had driven them from the South and others that had met them in the North. And they spoke with force and a determination in their newspapers, their speeches, and their stories and poems. Then as now, Black America spoke in more than one voice. In Harlem in the 1920s, one could find W.E.B. Du Bois's thundering editorials about lynching in The Crisis, the periodical of the NAACP. Also prominent were more cautious positions taken in the Urban League Bulletin, and less cautious positions taken by A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen in The Messenger, and a very prominent and complicating voice in Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association. The voices were varied, but awareness of injustice was universal. That awareness will appear in some of the poems we read this afternoon. Politics will never be far from our subject. We will not avoid it. But politics will, if allowed, crowd the frame of reference, overwhelm every other angle of vision. For this afternoon, we want to focus on something else. And for that, I turn to Nancy.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Nancy Diamond, co-chair of this celebration with Bruce. Bruce approached me after church a year ago, saying he had an idea for a program on Veterans Day 2022. He asked me if I'd be interested in planning a celebration in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. I said yes. In January of this year, we began the journey. After planning committee meetings, Zoom meetings, and 1,001 emails, here we are. What an incredible time in American history. The Harlem Renaissance was the beginning of a new African American identity and racial pride that would set the stage for the future. The contributions of so many talented people in the visual and performing arts had a profound effect upon literature, art, music, fashion, and activism. These pioneers influenced new generations of artists and inspired them to rise to new heights. The Harlem Renaissance left a lasting imprint in the US and around the world. What really struck me while researching authors from this period is that Black people may have been put in the same box, but we didn't stay there. We are a very diverse people. The Black American experience is different for each of us, yet familiar. Our stories of love, joy, pain, success, and struggle are different for each of us, yet familiar. I was so happy to find that there were quite a few African American women poets from that time period. They were educated and eloquent. Some of these women worked at Crisis magazine, a publication that heralded the civil rights movement of the early 1900s. They were also very supportive of other authors and poets of their time. You will hear beautiful prose today from two of those voices. And of course, we will take time to honor our veterans. A list of local Black men who fought in the Revolutionary War of 1812, as well as Civil War, World War I, and World War II, will be read aloud. We are grateful for their service and for all who served our country during these times of conflict and peace. I leave you with this, a lyric from one of Duke Ellington's most iconic works. Hurry, get aboard, it's coming. Listen to those rails a thrumming all aboard. Get on board the A train. Soon you will be on Sugar Hill in Harlem. Harlem has come to Bangor. Let's get on board.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Sichters, and I have the biographies and context, and it's going to be really hard to follow Nancy, but here we go. February 17, 1919 was an unofficial holiday in Harlem. Adults left work, schools were closed, and it seemed that all of Harlem thronged Lenox Avenue. Their men, the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, were marching home. One of the most highly decorated units in the American Army, the 369th spent a record 191 days on the front lines in France and were the first Allied regiment to cross the Rhine. On that February 17th, W.E.B. Du Bois was in France leading the Second Pan-African Conference. Writer, sociologist, historian, and activist, Du Bois was one of the founding members of the NAACP and the primary intellectual backer of the Harlem Renaissance. Born in Massachusetts in 1868, Du Bois grew up in an integrated neighborhood and later taught history, economics, and politics at Atlanta University. Du Bois harbored complex feelings about the Great War, a war for which many Black Americans were asked to fight for freedoms abroad that they were denied at home. To win those freedoms, Du Bois believed that a talented tenth, that small number of educated artists, scientists, and intellectuals, would lead the race in cultural advancement. Art, for Du Bois, therefore, played an important role in raising up a people and creating a civilization. Embodying those talented tenth ideals, a crop of young artists came to prominence in the early and mid-20s, just as Harlem captured the world's attention as a mecca of art, music, and culture. The most famous of the movement, and now one of America's most beloved poets, Langston Hughes was born in Joplin, Missouri, but grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, where he was voted class poet in grammar school. In 1923, after dropping out of Columbia University, he joined the Merchant Marines and traveled to West Africa and Europe. His first published poem, A Negro Speaks of Rivers, appeared in The Crisis in 1921. Hughes dedicated this definitive example of the talented 10th style to its editor, W.E.B. Du Bois. Hughes's friend and collaborator, the novelist, anthropologist, and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston, grew up in Eatonville, Florida, a middle-class African-American haven that served as a setting for many of her writings. Hurston studied at Howard University, but in 1925 enrolled at Manhattan's Barnard College and earned her BA in anthropology in 1928 when she was 37 years old. After graduation, she traveled and did ethnographic research in the Caribbean and the American South. That study, combined with Hurston's ear for cultural details, led her to represent the voices of her characters in Black Southern vernacular. Her second novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, published in 1937, is considered her masterpiece. Alongside Hughes and Hurston, Gwendolyn Bennett was one of the founding editors of the short-lived but influential literary journal Fire. Born in Texas, Bennett lived in Nevada, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania before her family settled in Brooklyn. Celebrated for her paintings and poetry, Bennett studied fine arts at Columbia University, the Pratt Institute, and in France. A passionate advocate of Black women's rights, Bennett taught graphic arts at Howard University and was the director of the Harlem Community Arts Center from 1937 to 1940. Also noted for her feminist themes, poet, writer, and activist Georgia Douglas Johnson did not live in Harlem, but was an essential organizing force of the movement. Soon after her husband died in 1925, Johnson founded the Saturday Salon in her Washington, D.C. home. For 40 years, it served as the gathering spot for the giants of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as other artists and thinkers. There, noted Saturday nighters included Du Bois, Hurston, Hughes, Countee Cullen, Jean Toomer, Sterling Brown, Angelica Weld Grimke, James Weldon Johnson, Vachel Lindsay, and Maine's own Edna St. Vincent Millay. They gathered to share ideas and discuss their works. Of all of these voices, Countee Cullen was the unofficial poet laureate of the movement. He was the adopted son of Frederick Cullen, the Reverend of Harlem's Salem Methodist Episcopal Church and a respected community leader. Countee Cullen published his first poem at 15 and won numerous prizes through his studies at NYU. Unlike his friend Langston Hughes, who turned to jazz rhythms to structure his poetry, Cullen was the exemplar of the urbane, talented 10th style. He mastered European forms, including the sonnet and the ballad. Cullen's poem Heritage was published in the March 1925 special edition of the Survey Graphic, titled Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro. This volume announced the Renaissance to America and the world. With its now famous opening line, "What is America to me?" The poem takes sides on Garveyism, the Back to Africa movement that swept through Harlem and served as one of the many dividing lines of the Renaissance.
My name is David Patrick. I'll be reading W.E.B. Du Bois, Returning Soldiers. In the aftermath of World War I, W.E.B. Du Bois urged returning soldiers to continue fighting for democracy at home. We are returning from war. The crisis and tens of thousands of Black men were drafted into a great struggle. For bleeding France and what she means and has meant and will mean to us and humanity, and against the threat of German race arrogance. We fought gladly into the last drop of blood for America and her highest ideals. We fought in far-off hope for the dominant Southern oligarchy entrenched in Washington. We fought in bitter resignation for the America that represents and gloats in lynching, disenfranchisement, caste, brutality, and devilish insult. For this, in the hateful upturning and mixing of things, we were forced by vindictive fate to fight also. But today we return. We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don, to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing. This country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It lynches. And lynching is barbarism of a degree and contemptible nastiness unparalleled in human history. Yet for 50 years, we have lynched 2 Negroes a week. And we have kept this up right through the war. It disenfranchises its own citizens. Disenfranchisement is the deliberate theft and robbery of the only protection of poor against rich and black against white. The land that disenfranchises its citizens and calls itself a democracy lies and know it lies. It encourages ignorance. It has never really tried to educate the Negro. A dominant minority does not want Negroes educated. It wants servants, dogs, whores, and monkeys. And when this land allows a reactionary group, by its stolen political power, to force as many black folk into these categories as possibly can, it cries in contemptible hypocrisy. They threaten us with degeneracy. They cannot be educated. It steals from us. It organizes industry to cheat us. It cheats us out of land. It cheats us out of labor. It confiscates our savings. It reduces our wages. It raises our rent. It steals our profit. It taxes us without representation. It keeps us consistently and universally poor, and then feeds us on charity and derides our poverty. It insults us. It has organized a nationwide and laterally a worldwide propaganda of deliberate and continuous insult and defamation of black blood wherever found. It decrees that it shall not be possible in travel nor residence, work nor play, education nor instruction, for a black man to exist without tacit or open acknowledgement of his inferiority to the dirtiest white dog. And it looks upon any attempt to question or even discuss this dogma as arrogance, unwanted assumption, and treason. This is the country to which we soldiers of democracy return. This is the fatherland for which we fought, but it is our fatherland. It was right for us to fight. The faults of our country are our faults. Under similar circumstances, we would fight again. But by God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that this war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return from fighting. We return from fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why.
My name is Angela Okafor, and I'll be reading The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen his muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Thank you.
I want to say a few words about the masterpiece by Zora Neale Hurston, Because it is a novel and not a poem, I think some background information will help you make sense of the passages I selected. Hurston wrote her characters with the mind of a folklorist. She loved the language of her people, those who lived in southern Florida in the Everglades. You'll hear the language of Black people of that time and place. It's authentic and gives the characters their own unique personality and outlook on life. The characters that you will hear about today are Nanny, Janie, Tea Cake, and the townspeople. Our protagonist, Janie, is a light-skinned Black woman with good hair. And her nanny, a former slave, very much wants Janie to use her looks to reach higher ground, especially in the Jim Crow South. Janie needed to marry a good man and an acceptable man who had land and a home. Against protest, Janie marries not one, but two good men who made her miserable. Then, in her older years, she meets a ne'er-do-well, a much younger man named Tea Cake, and she falls madly in love with him. Though their relationship was not perfect, Janie is able to break out of that box and grab at the chance of true love and adventure. There are many ups and downs, danger, and tragedy. Yet, at the end of this beautiful novel, there is triumph. Janie returns home and finds her best friend, Phoebe, and begins to tell her the story of her life with Tea Cake. I think the victory is Janie's determination to live life on her own terms, accepting all the good, the bad, and the ugly situations in her life that tried her very soul but didn't destroy her. I believe Janie found her voice and obtained self-actualization. I don't think she would have changed a thing. Here are some excerpts from Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God." Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, away in resignation. His dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. Now, women forget all those things they don't want to remember, and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is truth. Then they act and do things accordingly. I wants to see you married right away. Who am I going to marry offhand like that? I don't know nobody. The Lord will provide. He know I done bore the burden in the heat of the day. Somebody done spoke to me about you long time ago. I said nothing, 'cause that wasn't the way I placed you. I wanted you to pick up to school out and pick from a higher bush and a sweeter berry. But that ain't your idea, I see. Nanny, who that been asking you for me? Brother Logan Killix. He's a good man, too. No, Nanny, no, ma'am. Is that what he been hanging around here for? He looked like some old skullhead in the graveyard. The older woman sat bolt upright and put her feet to the floor and thrust back the leaves from her face. So you don't want to marry off decent like, do ya? You just wants to hug and kiss and feel around with first one man and then the other, huh? You wants to make me suck the same sorrow your mama did, eh? My old head ain't gray enough? My back ain't bowed enough to suit ya? The vision of Logan Killix was desecrating the pear tree. But Janie didn't know how to tell Nanny that. She merely hunched over and pouted at the floor. Janie, yes, ma'am. You answer me when I speak. Don't you set pouting with me after all I done went through for you. Tea Cake, where you get a comb from to be combing my hair with? I brought it with me. Come prepared to lay my hands on it tonight. Why, tea cake, what good to combing my hair do you? It's my comfortable, not yourn. It's mine too. I ain't been sleeping so good for more than a week 'cause I've been wishing so bad to get my hands in your hair. It is so pretty. It feels just like underneath a dove's wing next to my face. You mightily easy satisfied. I've been had this same hair next to my face ever since I cried the first time, and it ain't never give me no thrill. I tell you like you told me, you's mighty hard to satisfy. I bet you them lips don't satisfy you neither. That's right, tea cake. They's there, and I make use of them whenever it's necessary, but nothing special to me. I bet you don't never go to the looking glass and enjoy your eyes yourself. You let other folks get all the enjoyment out of them without taking in any of it yourself. Nah, I never gazes at 'em. I ain't been told about it. See that? You's got the whole world in a jug and make out you don't know it. But I'm glad to be the one to tell you. It was after the picnic that the town began to notice things and got mad. Tea Cake and Mrs. Mayor Starks, all the men she could get, and fooling around with somebody like Tea Cake. Another thing, Joe Starks hadn't been dead but 9 months, and here she goes sashaying off to a picnic in pink linen. Done quit attending church like she used to. Gone off to Sanford in a car with Tea Cake, and her all dressed in blue. It was a shame. Done took the high-heel slippers and a $10 hat. Looking like some young girl, always in blue because Tea Cake told her to wear it. Tea Cake and Janie gone hunting. Tea Cake and Janie gone fishing. Tea Cake and Janie gone to Orlando to the movies. Tea Cake and Janie gone to a dance. Tea Cake in a borrowed car and teaching Janie to drive. Tea Cake and Janie playing checkers, playing Florida flip on the store porch all afternoon as if nobody else was there. Day after day and week after week. Jacksonville. Tea Cake's letter had said Jacksonville. He had worked in the railroad shops up there before, and his old boss had promised him a job come next payday. No need for Janie to wait. Janie's train left too early in the day for the town to witness much, but the few who saw her leave bore plenty witness. They had to give it to her. She sure looked good, but she had no business doing it. And there was Tea Cake in the big old station in a new blue suit, hauling her off to a preacher's house first thing. He was getting drowsy. We're going on to Muck. What's the Muck, and where's it at? Oh, down into Everglades, round Clewiston and Belglade, where they raise all that cane and string beans and tomatoes. Folks don't do nothing down there but make money and fun and foolishness. We must go there. He drifted off into sleep, and Janie looked down on him and felt a self-crushing love. So her soul crawled out from its hiding place. So she, Tea Cake, was home by herself one afternoon when she saw a band of Seminoles passing by. She had seen Indians several times in the glades, in twos or threes, but this was a large party. They were headed towards Palm Beach Road and kept moving steadily. About an hour later, another party appeared and went the same way. Then another just before sundown. This time, she asked where they were going, and at last, one of the men answered her. Going to high ground. Sawgrass bloom, hurricane coming. Everybody was talking about it that night, but nobody was worried. Sometime that night, the winds came back. Everything in the world had a strong rattle, sharp and short. It woke old Okeechobee, and the monster began to roll in his bed. The folks in the quarters and the people in the big houses further around the shore heard the big lake and wondered. The people felt uncomfortable but safe because there were the seawalls to change the senseless monster to his bed. The folks let the people do the thinking. If the castles thought themselves secure, the cabins needn't worry. The wind came back with triple fury and put out the light for the last time. They sat in company with the others in other shanties, their eyes straining against crude walls and their souls asking if he meant to measure their puny might against his. They seemed to be staring at the dark, but their eyes were watching God.
My name is Madison Hemingway, and I will be reading 2 poems tonight, the first of which is called To a Dark Girl by Gwendolyn Bennett. I love you for your brownness and the rounded darkness of your breast. I love you for the breaking sadness in your voice and the shadows where your wayward eyelids rest. Something of old forgotten queens lurks in the lithe abandon of your walk, and something of the shackled slave sobs in the rhythm of your talk. Oh, little brown girl, born for sorrow's mate, keep all you have of queenliness, forgetting that you were once a slave, and let your full lips laugh at fate. The second poem I have for you tonight is The Heart of a Woman by Georgia Douglas Johnson. The heart of a woman goes forth with the dawn, as a lone bird, soft winging, so restlessly on. Afar o'er life's turrets and valves does it roam. In the wake of those echoes, the heart calls home. The heart of a woman falls back with the night and enters some alien cage in its plight, and tries to forget it has dreamed of the stars while it breaks, breaks, breaks on the sheltering bars. Thank you.
Heritage by County Cullen. What is Africa to me? Copper sun or scarlet sea, jungle star or jungle track, strong bronzed men or regal black women from whose loins I sprang when the birds of Eden sang. 3 centuries removed from the scenes his fathers loved, spicy grove, cinnamon tree. What is Africa to me? So I lie, who all day long want no sound except the song, sung by wild barbaric birds, goading massive jungle herds, juggernauts of flesh that pass, trampling tall, defiant grass, where young forest lovers lie, plighting troth beneath the sky. So I lie, who always hear, though I cram against my ear both my thumbs and keep them there, great drums throbbing through the air. So I lie, whose font of pride, dear distress, and joy allied, is my somber flesh and skin, with the dark blood dammed within, like great pulsing tides of wine that I fear must burst the fine channels of the chafing net where they surge and foam and fret. Africa? A book one thumbs listlessly till slumber comes. Unremembered are her bats, circling through the night, her cats, crouching in the river reeds, stalking gentle flesh that feeds by the river brink. No more does the bugle-throated roar cry that monarch claws have leapt from the scabbards where they slept. Silver snakes that once a year doff the lovely coats you wear. Seek no convert in your fear, lest a mortal eye should see. What's your nakedness to me? There no leprous flowers rear, fierce corollas in the air. Here no bodies sleek and wet, dripping mangled rain and sweat. Tread the savage measures of jungle boys and girls in love. What is last year's snow to me? Last year's anything. The tree, budding yearly, must forget how its past arose or set. Bough and blossom, flower, fruit, even what shy bird with mute wonder at her travail there, meekly labored in its hair. 3 centuries removed from the scenes his father loved, spice grove, cinnamon tree, what is Africa to me? So I lie, who find no peace night or day, no slight release from the unremittent beat made by cruel padded feet walking through my body's street. Up and down they go and back, treading out the jungle track. So I lie, who never quite safely slept from rain at night. I can never rest at all when the rain begins to fall. Like a soul gone mad with pain, I must watch its weird refrain. Ever must I twist and squirm, writhing like a baited worm, while its primal measures drip through my body, crying, strip, doff this new exuberance, come and dance the lover's dance, an old remembered way. Rain works on me night and day. Quaint, outlandish heathen gods, black men fashioned out of rods, clay and brittle bits of stone in a likeness like their own. My conversion came high-priced. I belong to Jesus Christ, preacher of humility. Heathen gods are naught to me. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, I make an idle boast. Jesus of the twice-turned cheek, Lamb of God, although I speak with my mouth thus, in my heart do I play a double part. Ever at thy glowing altar must my heart grow sick and falter, wishing he I served were black, thinking it would not lack precedent of pain to guide it, let who would or might deride it. Surely then this flesh would know, yours had borne a kindred woe. Lord, I fashioned dark gods too, daring even to you, dark despairing features wear, crowned with dark rebellious hair. Patience wavers just so much as mortal grief compels, while touches quick and hot of anger rise to smitten cheek and weary eyes. Lord, forgive me if my need sometimes shapes a human creed. All day long and all night through, one thing only I must do, quench my pride and cool my blood, lest I perish in the flood, lest a hidden ember set timber that I thought was wet, burning like the driest flax, melting like the merest wax, lest the grave restores dead. Not yet has my heart or head in the least way realized, they and I are civilized.
Hi, I'm Brennan Maloney. When the committee was putting together this program, Nancy emphasized that it was going to be not just about Black suffering, but about Black joy. And that resonated I work as a psychotherapist, and one of my specialties is trauma treatment. We often talk about post-traumatic growth, the idea that many folks who experience even severe trauma go on to create deeply meaningful and even joyful lives afterwards. I'm honored to have been asked to share more about that and about how it can shed light on the Harlem Renaissance. I'm going to start by talking a bit about therapy and the church and race, and then we'll get to the trauma part. My vocation as a therapist has pushed me to think about race. Part of my job is to listen to my clients with an open heart, to set aside my ego to hear their experiences, even those far outside my own familiarity. Black clients often fear that white therapists will disbelieve or downplay their experiences of racism, or that we'll see paranoia and pathology instead of a reasonable response to racism. There's unfortunately a well-documented history of white providers doing just that. And even well-intentioned white therapists can still get defensive or be ignorant in ways that harm clients of color. For a client to share a trauma, they have to trust that I'll handle their story with care and respect. And for a client to talk with me about race or working to understand their racial identity or the racism they've experienced, they have to trust that I'll take their story seriously and treat it with care. Listening well and treating people with care is something that the church can also offer. I didn't have the tools to think about race as a kid. I grew up in Bangor in the 80s and 90s and sang in the church choir here at St. John's. And at the time, Maine was less racially diverse even than it is now. To give you an idea, Bangor High School had about 1,200 students when I was there. And I don't think I ever had a class with any of the maybe dozen Black students there at the time. Church was, in fact, the only place where I reliably interacted with Black folks growing up in Bangor. At its best, the church asks us to be radically open to our neighbors. It asks us to open our hearts to the inherent dignity and worth of every person we meet. And it asks us to treat them with love and care. It asks us to hear the stories of both people we can relate to easily and also people we have a harder time relating to. It asks us to take seriously that every person has something to offer and that each of our stories carries importance, something I bring to work with me every day. I've witnessed life-shattering traumas, but I've also seen how so many people find ways to create joyful, meaningful lives on the other side. In that spirit, I'm going to share about how a journey into some of the most painful human experiences can eventually forge a path to joy and how we might see this reflected in the Harlem Renaissance. But first, trauma itself. Trauma is an event or series of events that overwhelm our ability to cope, leaving us helpless and terrified. This experience affects us mentally, physically, and spiritually. The psychiatrist Judith Herman writes that traumatic events violate the victim's faith in a natural or divine order and cast the victim into a state of existential crisis. Traumatic events destroy the victim's fundamental assumptions about the safety of the world, the positive value of the self, and the meaningful order of creation. Changes to our brains and nervous systems after a trauma can be long-lasting and measurable. These changes are meant to be short-term and to let us respond quickly and decisively to threats to our lives through an involuntary fight, flight, or freeze response. In some cases, those changes become chronic and disruptive. And in our culture, that often takes the form of post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is essentially a normal response to an abnormal situation, one that persists even after its usefulness has passed. We've also started to learn that the changes from trauma can be passed down in our DNA so that we can carry a genetic memory of ancestral traumas in our own lives. The psychiatrist and neuroscientist Stephen Porges says that trauma is a chronic disruption of connection. The effects of trauma disconnect us from awareness of our own bodies, and they disconnect us from people around us as we struggle to feel safe being open and knowing who to trust. In fact, community support after trauma can mitigate post-traumatic symptoms, while a negative response can worsen the trauma by reinforcing feelings of disconnection and lack of safety. Research shows that being a victim of racism can lead to the same constellation of post-traumatic symptoms, just as being a victim of violence or abuse, or living through a natural disaster, or going to war can. Encountering racism, whether small or large scale, whether once or repeatedly, can lead to the same overwhelm and disconnection that we've talked about. It can happen directly, and it can also happen indirectly via genetic memory. We call that racial trauma. Black therapists and psychiatrists like Resmaa Menakem and others have pioneered ways to address and heal racial trauma. And these days, many more white therapists are also learning how to recognize and effectively help clients of color with this. If trauma takes away our agency and control in our lives, therapy for trauma involves regaining control and putting you back in the driver's seat of your own life. It involves learning how to re-regulate an overwhelmed nervous system, how to manage the accompanying ups and downs in mood, how to come back into the present from a flashback, and how to build healthy, safe, and supportive relationships. And it involves allowing the person to tell their own story. What happened to you is real. The way it affected you is real. Owning your own story and telling it on your own terms is one of the best ways we know to help people heal from trauma. It changes trauma from something that was done to you to something you experienced. This awful thing happened to me, and now I have to incorporate the reality of that awfulness into my understanding of the world. I'm not the same person. My life won't ever be the same again, but I'm more than what was done to me, and I decide how to make a meaningful life after what I've been through. There can be a peculiar sort of exaltation for trauma survivors in finally telling their own story to themselves or to others. Art, music, and poetry are excellent tools for doing this. They make us the author of our own lives. They allow us to tell our stories, even the most painful parts, with compassion and clarity and a yearning to be seen by others and to offer sustenance to others who are suffering. The Black church knows this well. Storytelling traditions in many cultures have intuitively known that stories are powerful medicine for our hurts, and that just as trauma can be passed down through the generations, so can the ways that we write ourselves in its wake. The 1920s and 30s were a particularly hard time to be Black in this country. The Ku Klux Klan was surging, lynchings were widespread, returning Black World War I soldiers were excluded from the benefits and recognition their white counterparts received, and Black families were segregated into subpar housing and schools. And yet, in the midst of that onslaught of violent racism, something that we know traumatizes many who endure it, the Harlem Renaissance happened. of flowering of art and music and poetry, Black folks telling their own stories and healing themselves and reconnecting their communities through the power of art, and then passing the fruits of their labors down the generations to their descendants and to all of us. It's a gift, the gift of healing for themselves and their communities, one done instinctively and with great care and delight in the various art forms they worked in. And it's one that's endured to bear fruit for future generations, wrestling with new forms of racism in a changed world. The Black experience in America is multifaceted, as Nancy touched on, and today's program reflects one especially vibrant movement in Black history. Black joy, Black spirituality, Black art, Black music, Black poetry. These allow for a full life in the wake of racial trauma. This is post-traumatic growth, finding a new way to joy and meaning, telling a new story. Just like the therapy room, this community and so many others like it give us an opportunity to witness and share our stories and the complex joys of being alive. And that witnessing is crucial to post-traumatic growth. It's a reconnection, it's an acknowledgement, and it's a way to build a new life when your old one has been shattered. My job is a huge privilege and honor. People are trusting me with the most personal parts of their lives. And I think we can all feel as privileged and honored to witness the stories of the Harlem Renaissance and their expression of the bittersweetness of Black life in America and the joy of Black lives lived to the fullest and creating with abandon. Thank you.
Neither will I be trying that.
So this is unfair. I have to follow up that as well. So I'm going to start with some biography and context for our next set of readers. But first, I want to start with Aaron Douglas. The cover of your program is illustrated by Aaron Douglas's Song of the Towers, one of 4 murals in the WPA-sponsored series, Aspects of Negro Life. Dominating the center is a saxophonist raising his instrument in triumph, power radiating from it in concentric circles. He wards off the threats of modern industrial life that loom in the foreground, while hailing the promise of freedom seen in the distance through the narrow straits. In 1925, Aaron Douglas was teaching at a Kansas City high school when Charles Johnson of Opportunity magazine lured him to Harlem, telling the artist, quote, "Better to be a dishwasher in New York than to be the head of a high school in Kansas City," unquote. It worked. After settling in Harlem, Douglas further developed his style, melding African and modern influences to become the unofficial painter of the movement. His images were everywhere, as covers of magazines, illustrations of poetry, and murals adorning libraries, halls, and galleries. Douglas later apprenticed with the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, studied in Paris, and founded Fisk University's art department, where he taught from 1940 to 1966. When his first book of poems, Harlem Shadows, was published in 1922, 100 years ago, Claude McKay was the most famous poet of African descent writing in English, and co-editor of the radical socialist journal, The Liberator. Yet later that year, as the Renaissance gained momentum, McKay was living abroad and wouldn't return to Harlem for more than a decade. Born in Jamaica in 1889, McKay received a classic British education where he studied European poetry and developed a love for Shakespeare. He not only mastered the sonnet form, but also transformed it into a powerful tool of protest. True to his education, McKay could also write achingly lyrical poems such as The Tropics of New York, which longs for the lost pastoral Jamaica of his youth. Claude McKay also offended W.E.B. Du Bois with his novel Home to Harlem, with its frank depictions of Harlem nightlife and the lives of its, quote, uprooted black vagabonds, unquote. Langston Hughes, too, chafed under the middle-class values of the talented 10th. In his 1926 manifesto, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, Hughes announced his intention to celebrate, quote, the low-down folks, the so-called common element, and they are the majority. May the Lord be praised. The people who have their nip of gin on Saturday nights and are not too important to themselves or the community, or too well-fed, or too learned to watch the lazy world go round. They live on 7th Street in Washington, or State Street in Chicago, and they do not particularly care whether they are like white folks or anybody else. Their joy runs bang into ecstasy. Their religion soars to a shout, unquote. Hughes' The Weary Blues captures these values of Harlem's underclasses. The poem was a sensation. It took first prize and was read aloud by James Weldon Johnson at the celebrated Opportunity Banquet in 1925. Adopting the street rhythms of jazz, The Weary Blues announced Langston Hughes' turn to increasingly iconoclastic, political, and experimental poetry. And because Dylan Murray cannot make it tonight, I will do my best to fill in and read the next 2 poems. The Tropics of New York by Claude McKay. Bananas, ripe and green, and ginger root, cocoa in pods, and alligator pears, and tangerines, and mangoes, and grapefruit fit for the highest prize at parish fairs, sat in the window, bringing memories of fruit-laden trees by low singing rills, and dewy dawns, and mystical skies, and benediction over none-like hills. My eyes grow dim. and I could no more gaze. A wave of longing through my body swept, and hungry for the old familiar ways, I turned aside and bowed my head and wept. A little change of tone here. College Formal, Renaissance Casino by Langston Hughes. Golden girl in a golden gown and a melody night in Harlem town. Lad, tall and brown, tall and wise, college boy smart, eyes in eyes. The music wraps them both around in mellow magic of dancing sound, till they're the heart of the whole big town, gold and brown.
name's Tessa Solomon, and I have 2 poems to share with you guys today. The first one is The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes. Droning a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a melancholy croon, I heard a Negro play down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of an old gas light. He did a lazy sway, he did a lazy sway, to the tune, oh, those weary blues, with his ebony hands on each ivory key. He made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues, swaying to and fro on his rickety stool. He played that sad, raggedy tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues, coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues, in a deep song voice with a melancholy tune. I heard that Negro sing, that old piano moan. Ain't got nobody in all this world, ain't got nobody but myself. I ain't got nobody but myself. I whined to quit my frowin' and put my troubles on the shelf. Thump, thump, thump went his foot on the floor. He played a few chords, then he sang some more. I got those weary blues, and I can't be satisfied. I got those weary blues, and I can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more, and I wish that I had died. And far into the night, he crooned that tune. The stars went out, and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock or a man that's dead. The second poem I'm going to read is Fantasy by Gwendolyn Bennett. I sailed in my dreams to the land of night, where you were the dusk-eyed queen, and there, in the pallor of moon-veiled light, the loveliest things were seen. A slim-necked peacock sauntered there, in a garden of lavender hues, and you were strange with your purple hair, as you sat in your amnesty chair, with your feet in your shoes. Oh, the moon gave a blush light through the trees in the land of dreams and night. I stood behind a bush of yellow green and whistled a song to the dark-haired queen.
Our last poet is the singular Jean Toomer. Jean Toomer wrote of himself, "By hearsay there was in my heredity the following strains: Scotch, Welsh, German, English, French, Dutch, Spanish, with some dark blood. Let us assume the dark blood was Negro, or let's be generous and assume that it was both Negro and Indian. I personally can readily assume this because I cannot feel with certain of my countrymen that all of the others are all right, but that Negro is not. Blood is blood, my body is my body, with an already given and definite racial composition." Toomer was raised in Washington, D.C., the son of a formerly enslaved father and a free Southern woman of color. He never found peace with all the complexity in his background and upbringing, its challenges to self-identity, its social implications, the opportunities and hazards presented by his heritage and by his appearance. But he found coherence, harmonious and fruitful one time, in September through November of 1921, when he served as a visiting educator in Sparta, Georgia. In Sparta and the surrounding countryside, Toomer first saw the rural South, first heard the spirituals, first connected sound to landscape, and both to a way of life then disappearing. The deep meaning and poignancy he found in this encounter generated his book, Cain, a flowing collection of poetry, prose, and enigmatic symbolism set first in the South, then in the North, then in the South again. His masterpiece and the modernist masterpiece of the Harlem Renaissance. The poem Georgia Dusk is from the first southern section of Cain. It evokes the purple-tinged landscape of pine trees, sawmills, and smoke. It finds hope of redemption in the spirituals and, more distantly, in the African past of Black Southerners. At the close of this section, we will hear a piece by Samuel Coleridge Taylor, of whom I spoke in the introduction. Coleridge Taylor was born in London, the son of an African from Sierra Leone and a white Englishwoman. He was a violinist and composer with a particular interest in Black American cultural life as it existed during his short life from 1875 to 1912. Georgia Dusk. The sky, lazily disdaining to pursue the setting sun, too indolent to hold a lengthened tournament for flashing gold, passively darkens for night's barbecue. A feast of moon and men and barking hounds, an orgy for some genius of the South with blood-hot eyes and cane-lipped scented mouth, surprised in making folk songs from soul sounds. The sawmill blows its whistle, buzzsaws stop, and silence breaks the bud of knoll and hill, soft settling pollen where plowed lands fulfill their early promise of a bumper crop. Smoke from the pyramidal sawdust pile curls up, blue ghosts of trees, tarrying low where only chips and stumps are left to show the solid proof of former domicile. Meanwhile, the men, with vestiges of pomp, race memories of king and caravan, high priests, an ostrich, and a juju man, go singing through the footpaths of the swamp. Their voices rise. The pine trees are guitars, strumming. Pine needles fall like sheets of rain. The voices rise. The chorus of the cane is caroling a vesper to the stars. O singers, resinous and soft your songs above the sacred whisper of the pines. Give virgin lips to cornfield concubines. Bring dreams of Christ to dusky cane-lipped throngs. For our reflection, we return to W.E.B. Du Bois, who in his best-known book, The Souls of Black Folk, included a chapter entitled Of Alexander Crummell. In that chapter, Du Bois tells of a man of great age who had avoided 3 temptations: the temptation of hate that stood out against the red dawn, the temptation of despair that darkened noonday, and the temptation of doubt that ever steals along with twilight. Above all, Du Bois wrote, you must hear of the vales he crossed, the valley of humiliation and the valley of the shadow of death. Alexander Crummell was a Black American who was born in 1819 and died in 1898. Du Bois was born in 1868. By the time the two met, Crummell was an old man, Du Bois was still young, and Crummell had suffered his temptations of hate, despair, and doubt on the many occasions disrespect and indignity had been inflicted on him. An example. As a boy in New York, Crummell was invited to attend a school in New Hampshire. According to Du Bois, the godly farmers attached 90 yoke of oxen to the abolition schoolhouse and dragged it into the middle of the swamp. The black boy trudged away. Alexander Crummell persisted through every frustration and humiliation. He studied at Queen's College, Cambridge, worked for decades in West Africa, and became an early leader in the Pan-African movement. He was a talented and determined man, and he made the most of what he had been given. But his story is of more than ambition, grit, or stoic endurance. In his own long life, W.E.B. Du Bois did not settle comfortably into religious conviction, but he employed religious terms and imagery in his writing, and he was at one time a parishioner at St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Harlem. Alexander Crummell was an Episcopal clergyman. That is the frame through which Du Bois saw Crummell's life and character. That is what took Crummell to England and to Africa. I must acknowledge that more than one of Crummell's humiliations were inflicted by white churchmen. But Crummell was truer than they to the mission of the church, and he made the church more his own than it was truly theirs. He served as a priest in Liberia and later founded St. Luke's Church in Washington, D.C. He also founded a national convocation that became the Union of Black Episcopalians. St. Luke's in Foggy Bottom and the UBE thrive to this day. Crummell lived with determination in the service of both immediate goals and long-term hopes. But Du Bois, in his dreamy prose, describes Crummell as more than just a useful actor in history. He describes Crummell's serenity in adversity, and at one point he quotes a book he and Crummell both knew. In the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, St. John wrote, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them, and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away.'" Alexander Crummell lived in the United States and in England and in Africa, in the church and in society, and he lived in both time and eternity. His ambitions for society were greater than voting rights, access to public accommodations, or desegregated schools, greater even than an end to racial terror and violence. The new world he pursued was indeed one of justice and equity, the civic obligations we owe one another but often do not pay. But even more, a world of peace, of harmony, of reconciliation, all born of love. Crummel's life, therefore, was lived in both time and eternity. This did not make it an exception, it was an example. What then of Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Gwendolyn Bennett? What of the Duke and his orchestra and his dancers? They were examples of the same thing. They all lived beyond their times. I do not know the Nicholas brothers' immediate thoughts as they leapfrogged those splits down the staircase, but in their dance they created for their time and for all time. So did all the artists of the Harlem Renaissance. All of them called forth a new heaven and a new earth, and they call it forth still. Today's program is dedicated to 3 members of this parish. In the center, Sterling A. Diamond, Jr. Mr. Diamond was born in Bangor on September 20, 1920, to Sterling Sr. and Janie Mae Simmons Diamond, the 9th of 10 children. He attended Bangor schools and graduated from Bangor High School in 1938. Sterling and his family would walk to St. John's in good weather. He was baptized here in 1922, became a member at 17, and was a faithful servant at the parish for 70 years. He served on the vestry twice as junior warden, led the office angels who put together the weekly bulletin, was a helper at the second Saturday free community lunch, where his homemade baked beans were in demand, co-led the altar guild, and was always available to do whatever task needed to be done. Sterling's lifelong desire was to be an engineer. In his 40s, he entered Hurston College and received an associate's degree in engineering. He was hired as an engineering technician with the USDA Soil Conservation Service and retired in 1985. He also worked for 17 years with the Maine Central Railroad on the Van Buren Run. In retirement, he worked at events at the old Bangor Auditorium, where he loved to greet friends and strangers alike. Sterling was a member of North Star Lodge No. 22, Prince Hall Masons, jurisdiction of Massachusetts, where he held many positions. Sterling died on January 6, 2014, at the age of 93, after a life well lived. He loved music, especially jazz, and he would certainly have been in the pews today enjoying the time period of his youth. To Sterling's right, to your left, is Helena G. Diamond George. I mentioned Mr. Diamond was the 9th of 10 children. His sister, Mrs. George, was the first of that group. When the Harlem Renaissance began, she was working at the Bar Harbor Tea Room. She married Edson George Sr. at Sur de Mont Springs in Acadia National Park and raised 7 children of her own. Mrs. George modeled adaptation and persistence. After her husband died and after all 7 children were out of the house and unavailable for transport, she learned how to drive. Mrs. George loved to entertain her family at Sunday dinners and as a member of the Mothers Club, a group of black women who met every other Thursday at the home of a member and shared their culinary efforts. And finally, to your right, Esther Nettles Rao, PhD. Dr. Rao's roots in the history of Black America run deep. She was born in Mobile, Alabama. Her father, the Reverend Abraham Nettles, had attended Tuskegee Institute when Booker T. Washington was the principal of the school, but not yet the president, and where his science teacher was George Washington Carver. Dr. Rao herself was awarded a PhD at Ohio State University, where she wrote her dissertation on the English poet and dramatist John Dryden. She holds an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Hurston University and is retired from teaching at the University of Maine as the inaugural Constance H. Carlson Distinguished Chair in the Humanities at Hurston and as Vice President of the Bangor Theological Seminary. Dr. Rao's volunteer work and service on boards extends beyond the Academy and beyond Eastern Maine. She has never stopped teaching. John Dryden was an unusual subject for an African-American scholar, but not for Dr. Rao. She continues to be an insightful guide to English literature from the Reformation through the Anglican Book of Common Prayer of 1662 to date, and to American literature, including our subject today, and continuing on through Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, and Toni Morrison. She most recently and characteristically has brought Metropolitan Opera broadcasts to school children in the region. With her late husband, Dr. Charles F. Chick Rao, Jr., a retired Rear Admiral of the United States Navy's submarine fleet, Dr. Rao has been a vibrant presence in the arts and academia and in this parish. We are pleased to dedicate this program to all 3.
And now we take time to recognize our veterans. First, recognition of local Black veterans. The names were taken from two books, Black Bangor, 1880 to 1950, by Dr. Maureen Elgersman Lee, and Maine's Visible Black History by H.H. Price and Gerald E. Talbot. Revolutionary War and War of 1812. Henry Van Meter, 1761 to 1871, originally a slave in Virginia, escaped and carried letters to the officers of General Wayne's army, fought in the War of 1812 on a privateer, was captured, and was a prisoner at Dartmoor Prison. Civil War Union Army. William Fenno, Paris O'Ree, 11th Maine Regiment, all served in the Spanish-American War and in the 8th and 18th Regiments. James W. Griffin, William Kelly, William H. Treadwell, August Van Meter, Henry Woodfield. World War I. Dean Davis saw overseas action in France, August 1917 to January 1919. Carlton Cromwell, John Lawrence, Oakley Patterson, Galen Leake, Charles Rainsford Talbot, U.S. Navy. And World War II. Richard A. Biggins, one of the first volunteers in 1941. Four sons of Sterling Diamond Sr., Paul, Kenneth, Edward Simmons, and brother-in-law Edson L. George Sr. Reginald Clark Sr., William Leake, Lorne McCarty, U.S. Army's 366th All-Black Infantry Regiment. Harold Duke Nelson, wounded in Germany, received a Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and a Presidential Citation. Daniel Sickles. Allison Buster Wise, one of the first volunteers in 1941. Roxanne Peters served in the Women's Army Corps. And now I look to the congregation, to the audience. Do we have veterans here? And if so, would you please stand? Any veterans? Oh, thank you. Lee. Thank you for standing, and to all those online who may be veterans, we thank you for your service.
Before we close the program, an invitation. Please join us in the Undercroft. There's a lot of food there, and I hope a lot of conversation as well. Right through that curtain there and through the door, there are stairs. There's an elevator. If you take the elevator, it's slow but reliable. Don't try to help the door to close. It'll do it on its own. Many thanks to Dylan Murray and Joshua Singer, who prepared for this program but were unable to participate, to our readers, Angela Okafor, Madison Hemingway, Tessa Solomon, and David Patrick, to our musicians, Marisa Solomon, Patty Stoll, Chris Nemeth, and John Patterson, To our poetry consultant, Jeff Sichters, our speaker, Brennan Maloney, our caterer, Priscilla Moncrief, our graphic designer, Leanne Maloney, and our master of technology, Eric Boberg, and to all of you for joining us either here or online. And thanks to Nancy Diamond. Invite us to sing. Invite us to sing.
We will now end our program with the singing of Lift Every Voice and Sing. Would you please stand as you're able? And the hymn is in your program.